This is the Grin Podcast, and I am Hindol Sengupta. I have a very special guest today, joining me all the way from Dallas, Texas. His name is Professor Pankaj Jain, and he teaches religion and philosophy at the University of North Texas. Thank you very much, Professor Jain, for being on the show.
Thank you, Hindol, for inviting me. It's great to be with you here.
Professor Jain actually is a bit of a celebrity. He recently was seen with Morgan Freeman in the famous show, trying to discover God in a sense, in the show that Morgan Freeman does. What is it called, Professor Jain? In Search of God?
Now, the story of God
The
on National
story of God.
Geographic. Yeah,
The
yeah,
story of God on National Geographic. So
right. And
congratulations
that,
on your TV appearance, so to speak.
thank you. It's coming actually next Tuesday, April 9th. It's still coming.
Great,
But it
wonderful.
was great, yeah.
We will all look forward to it. But
Thank
thanks
you.
for being on the Grin podcast. And I want to begin
Thank
by
you.
asking you a subject that is of great interest to you and has been for a while, and
Mhm.
indeed to me. Um, I want to ask you how can we contemplate non-violence in a world that seems so deeply violent all around us? Because,
Mhm.
at some point it seemed that kingdoms used to fight with each other, right? There was a lot
Right.
of violence and wars, and countries went to war against each
Mhm.
other. Today, the nature of violence seems particularly personal, particularly
Mhm.
intimate. In a world like that, how can we contemplate the sublime notion of nonviolence?
Yeah, I think all kinds of violence really, I think, are all interconnected. And not just violence, even action, reaction, the way we react to certain things happening to us. We all react in a certain way, and that eventually becomes used to become kind of a war that one country would take on other country, right? And so, more than 2,000, 3,000 years ago, our people sages and thinkers such as the Buddha and Mahavira, they saw this vicious cycle of violence and more revenge and whatnot, and they came to those conclusions after years of their meditation that all of these things are interlinked, and it starts with mind, goes on to speech, and then that goes on to action, right? So the way to stop all that violence has to begin somewhere, and that place has to be I, me, myself. I have to stop my reactions. I have to observe my thoughts. That is what I have to make myself nonviolent, and that will make the society or the country nonviolent. That's what has been happening. That's a teaching, at least in Buddhism and Jainism, for more than 2 millennia, and that Gandhi adopted famously in last century. And from Gandhi, we saw that spreading across the world through Dr. Martin Luther King in United States and Nelson Mandela in South Africa and so on. So I think it's a need of the hour, as you said, and we have to really wake up and stop this vicious cycle of violence.
Yes, so this whole Eastern philosophies,
Hmm.
Hinduism's entire thing of talking about all change that you want to see in the world really must
Right,
begin first with you, right?
right,
Because
right,
if
right.
it's you, the entity, should I say, called you, all change
Hmm.
begins from there, right?
Right,
Um,
exactly,
what
exactly.
I want to talk to you a little bit about something that you mentioned, and most
Hmm.
people don't understand it and grapple with this, that
Hmm.
a cycle of action and reaction at a very
Hmm.
basic day-to-day basis.
Hmm.
Somebody does something to us, we scream, we hurl abuse, we get
Hmm.
angry. That itself is the first root of violence, isn't it? And most
Yes,
people,
absolutely.
when they think of violence, they think of murder and war and things like that.
Hmm.
But at a very basic level, somebody does something to us, we write an angry message, shout at
Hmm.
somebody on the road. Violence begins from there, right?
Absolutely.
And this action and reaction that you spoke about. Could you talk to us a little bit more about this vicious cycle of action and reaction?
Yes, maybe I'll share an example actually just happened last week here in my class. I have a Jewish student in my class on Jainism, and he met a student uh, who attacked Israel from her perspective. And this my Jewish student, instead of reacting with more hatred, he said, "I pray for you." Yeah, she said that I wish that Israel should end. I mean, death to Israel is what she said, right? And this Jewish person, this student, says that I wish prosperity and peace for everybody in Palestine and in Israel. So look at that. That it's immediately he stopped that cycle right there. He would have again, if he wanted, he would have reacted more violently, very easily, right? But he was very aware and he stopped the cycle and eventually convinced that person to become his friend. And now they both are friends. This happened just last week, right here. So this is, I think, one very recent, excellent example in my mind here, right here at UNT. This is what has to happen. What has to happen, I think, more and more in our life, in my life also. That the way we stop that is by forgiveness, by compassion, by love, by stopping our reaction, by observing our own minds. And again, this is what Buddha and Mahavira teach more than 2 millennia ago. That's what was the meditation all about. That you are not your body, you are not your mind. You can control your reaction. You can observe your own mind. You can study mind with your own mind. These are some examples of when we take a distance from these reactions, these emotions, and think more objectively our own the way we react. That is where I think we can stop this cycle, right?
Fascinating. That's a fascinating story.
Thank you.
Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit more about the principle of nonviolence as adopted and adapted in various parts of the world in
Right.
your
Sure.
research, Professor Jain, because you've done so much research on this idea of the practice of nonviolence. A lot
Hmm.
of people, of course, consider Mahatma
Yes.
Gandhi's application of nonviolence, but there are
Yes.
many other examples. Gandhi and
Right.
Mandela, Nelson Mandela, are the
Hmm.
two most oft repeated examples. But there are many other examples of
Hmm.
grappling with the idea of nonviolence. And perhaps you could walk us through how different, through your research, you have understood how the practice of nonviolence can be done
Hmm.
in various places with various forms of practice.
Yes. So, yeah, we already mentioned Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, of course, was also in South Africa, and Gandhi also started his whole movement based on nonviolence right there in South Africa, right? And in between these two figures, we also have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. right here in the United States, in Alabama and other southern states, especially during the civil rights movement. And he also made several references to Mahatma Gandhi. Dr. King himself came to India and he visited the home of Gandhi in Mumbai, and he took a lot of inspiration from Gandhi and brought back into United States. With him, many other African leaders also went to India and similarly brought all that influence and inspiration based on nonviolent resistance methods from Gandhi, and that's all happened here in 1960s, for example. Based on their activism, Dr. King and other African American leaders' activism, immigration laws were changed in 1965 in the United States. And because of those new laws, people like me could enter the United States. Asians were allowed back into United States because of the way the whole idea of race was reformed. Earlier only whites were considered Americans before that, so Asians were stopped. And then 1965, because of the civil rights, people like me and many Asians, millions of Asians, could enter again into United States. Then we have recent examples where so these examples obviously Dr. Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, for example, there are pictures and scenes and even video films where police are launching these attacks on these nonviolent activists, and all they would do in reaction, instead of reacting back with violence, Dr. King and his colleagues and his friends, they would just kneel down and pray for the police. That's the kind of way they stopped that cycle of action and reaction that we talked about in the beginning. And because of their nonviolence and because of those images that became part of the consciousness of entire country, the whole country came together with Dr. King, and eventually the laws were changed. Voting Rights Act was passed in 1967. Immigration law was changed, as I mentioned, in 1965. Because of that, the entire country came together with Dr. King, and then, of course, the I Have a Dream speech, where Dr. King goes to DC and makes that speech. And in that speech, if you notice, I noticed very recently that the entire, many people in the crowd are wearing the Gandhi cap, famous Gandhi topi that we say in India. The Gandhi cap is actually seen very clearly with Dr. King. Dr. King himself did not have that Gandhi cap, but you see that Gandhi's influence, nonviolence influence in the entire movement, and even in that famous speech, "I Have a Dream" speech by Dr. King. And so because of that, because nonviolence was the key ingredient in his entire revolution, in entire movement, it made such a large impact in the country, and the country was reformed. Imagine if that movement had violence in it, I don't think the change would have happened so fast and so sudden. But because of the non-violence, it really worked in Gandhi's case, and in Dr. King's case, and Nelson Mandela's case, in three examples that we mentioned. But all these three are primarily in the realm of political change, social change, right? But we also have similar examples even after Dr. King's revolution here in America. We have the example of Sundarlal Bahuguna in the Himalayas in India, where government and corporate forces combined together, and they wanted to destroy the forests of the Himalayas. And men, women, and children in the Himalayas, led by leaders like Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, and others, they actually literally hugged the trees in the Himalayas, and they succeeded in stopping the violence against the trees in the Himalayas. And even today, I went to Uttarakhand for my Fulbright-based fellowship that I got in 2012, and I spent 2 months in the Himalayas. And as I traveled across across Uttarakhand, I saw that thousands and thousands of trees are still intact because of this non-violent resistance that Sundarlal Bahuguna and others adopted based on Gandhian methods, that we could save the forests in the Himalayas. Uh,
That's
Even before, and
interesting.
there are so many such examples. I can go on and on. Yes.
That brings me. That's a
Hmm.
lovely series of lovely stories,
Hmm.
Professor Jain. That brings
Yes.
me to the other topic that I was so keen on discussing
Hmm.
with you. Your immense research on environmentalism, because
Right.
of course the other great violence that we are committing every day in our world is violence upon nature, right?
Yes.
Um,
Hmm.
when we throw millions of plastic bags, when we
Yes.
destroy forests, when we poison the fields. I mean, that's another deep kind of violence. Tell us a
Right.
little bit about how your lifelong interest in nonviolence and nonviolence movements have got
Hmm.
intertwined in a sense with all your research in environmentalism.
Yes. So again, giving you an example just this morning from my class, there are two ways we can deal with the environmental crisis. One way is to deal with environmental crisis from technological perspective, science and technology, right? So there are plastics floating around in our oceans. So we devise a new technological solution to take care of the plastic, or let's say oil spill, right? There are and there can be more technological solutions, let's say to reflect the sunlight. So to control global warming, we can install huge reflectors in the deserts, for example, and that can reflect the sunlight, or maybe even block sunlight for a brief time. So those are all technological solutions. What can religion offer? What can religion or non-violence based religions can offer to stop climate change or to control global warming? They can prevent the things even before they happen, even before we start messing up with our oceans and rivers and mountains. The traditions based on nonviolence can help us inspire in preventing those problems to begin with, right? So, for example, if we take the example of Jainism, how Jainism adopted nonviolence in its practices is that they saw that even the earth, even the water and fire and wind, everything, even these things, what we might call as things, I think in our normal language, Jainism saw them as jiva. That wind is also a jiva, which means it has a soul. Earth is also a jiva, which means it has a soul, a distinct soul, and fire has its own distinct soul, and so on. Just like Hinduism sees Brahman in every particle of the universe, Jainism sees a distinct soul, not Brahman, not a unified soul, but a separate and distinct soul in each part, all of these entities in the universe. So because everything is living, so any way we consume these things, any way we exploit these things, causes karma particles to stick to our soul. So more we consume things in the universe, more we consume air, more fire we consume, or more earth we consume, it causes our soul to get polluted with karma particles. And how do we get liberation? Liberation is possible only when the soul is completely free of the karma particles, when the soul is completely clean. And the only way to clean the soul is by adopting non-violence 100% of your life, by your speech, action, and thought. So to be non-violent is to mean that you will not exploit, not abuse, not use these natural resources. Or if you have to use some natural resources, you will be very careful and very respectful, even towards air, fire, water, trees, and animals. So that became the fundamental rationale when thousands and thousands of Jains remain vegetarians even today, in last 2 millennia, from all the way starting from Mahavira and Buddha, when they were the strongest proponents of non-violence. That non-violence became part of the Jain diet for thousands of years, and it is still primarily the main staple diet of Jains is based on plants and vegetables and fruits. And because of the very careful and very less consumption of natural resources, that's one way to prevent all this mess that we are doing to our forests and oceans and so on. So by cutting down the consumption, by being very careful users of natural resources, is one way to deal with this environmental crisis. I hope
It's
I made
interesting.
sure I
You're
made all
essentially
these
saying
connections.
that we declutter our souls like we declutter our lives.
Hmm.
It reminds me of Mary Kondo's, lessons
Yes.
on decluttering your wardrobe and decluttering your room and your life. And you're
Right.
saying, in a sense, that Jainism teaches how to declutter your soul, in a sense.
Right. And yeah, decluttering, purifying, cleansing, they are like literally almost like these particles that get stuck to the soul as we do more things in the world, or as we live about our life, as we especially meat consumption, as we do violence towards animals and birds. That is the biggest kind of the negative karma that can be caused on the soul. So in Jain taxonomy, they categorized all the beings in the universe into in the way they how many senses they have. So humans, animals, and birds have five senses, right? But so to kill an animal or a bird is to kill a human being. It's an equal amount of negative karma that you get by killing a human being or by killing an animal or bird. So obviously those were ruled out for your own consumption. What was allowed to be consumed was only plant. And why plants were allowed? Because plants in their taxonomy had only one sense of touch only. Similarly, air, water, and earth and fire and plants, they all have only one sense of touch only. They're all living beings, but they have only one sense. Whereas mammals and birds and humans have five senses. So to cause violence to a five sense beings is much more violent than to cause violence to one sense beings, right? So fire, air, water, and earth and plants were all allowed to be consumed. But even in that taxonomy, any plant that is coming out of root or stem was again not allowed, was heavily discouraged. So for example, my own grandmother, she would not eat a potato or an onion, garlic, radish, carrot, and these vegetables, because they are all come from root or stem of a plant. Because so to eat a radish or to potato or onion or garlic is to cause violence to the entire plant. And that is again much more violent than to take a byproduct from a plant, for example, a mango or a banana. So you're not literally killing an entire plant if you take a fruit or a vegetable. So
Tell us,
that way, even within plants, there were
for
these gradation made. Yes.
listeners who may not know enough about Jainism, spend the next few seconds, in a sense, to tell our listeners a little more in depth
Right.
about what is Jainism, and where does it stand among world religions, what are its
Yes.
principal beliefs, so that people understand where all the philosophies that you're talking about. Of course, some of them overlap with Hinduism and Buddhism,
Hmm.
but there are some things that are uniquely Jain too. So
Yes.
tell our listeners, or give our listeners a little bit of a summary so that they understand better about Jainism.
Yes, so in long Indian history for thousands of years, there have been two parallel streams, so to speak. One stream is the Vedic tradition, which later was called as the Hindu tradition, or still is called as Hindu tradition, Hinduism or Hindu tradition or Hindu Dharma. The other stream is what is called as Shramana tradition, Shamana. Right? Sanskrit word Shraman means the tradition that is based that values more self-effort, the tradition that does not depend on any god or goddess or scripture, but the tradition that depends only on one's own self-effort for liberation. So Buddhism and Jainism continue to be the two most prominent examples of the Shramana tradition. There were many other kinds of Shramana sects also in ancient India, but they are eventually they all disappeared. But Buddhism and Jainism continue to survive. Buddhism much more outside India, in Tibet and China, Japan, and Thailand and elsewhere. And Jainism, for the most part, was limited within India. Today, in India, there might be 6 or 7 million Jain people across India. Now, philosophically, as you said, there are several overlaps in all these three ancient religions of India: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. All three accept karma theory in some way or the other. They all three accept a reincarnation theory as well in one way or the other, and so on. But the primary thing that differentiates Buddhism and Jainism from Hinduism is, as I said in the beginning, that Buddhism and Jainism especially, they reject gods, goddesses, and grace from coming from any god or goddess, or especially Buddhism and Jainism also rejected Vedas and the superiority of the Sanskrit language. Buddhism and Jainism especially highlighted, valued self-effort to that extent that that Mahavira, for example, Mahavira was the contemporary of the Buddha. Mahavira, also like the Buddha, was born as a prince, but he also renounced his princely life, his kingdom, his palace, and whatnot, and became a monk. And as he became an ascetic, as he was leaving his palace, there are legends that he even renounced his clothing, because even clothing he treated as a possession or as an attachment. So even he renounced his clothing and went completely naked. So that was the ultimate statement of renunciation, and simple life of an ascetic. And the way he achieved his liberation is that for 12 and a half years after he became this monk, he practiced to the ultimate. He practiced silence. He renounced food and water. He meditated, constantly, and just completely renounced all kinds of his bodily needs and whatnot. And eventually, after 12 and a half years, after all these extreme austere practices, he achieves his liberation, or what is in Jain circles, what is called as omniscience. So in his omniscience, now he can see the entire universe from his divine kind of vision. He can see past, present, and future. So he gets these great visionary insights, and then he's like the Buddha. He also spreads his discoveries, so to speak, and he emphasizes non-violence to that extreme that non-violence becomes synonymous with Jainism, and it has remained synonymous. Actually, the saying ahimsa parmo dharma, it comes from the Mahabharata, but now today Jains have adopted that line to really to the letter and to the spirit. So now Jains and Mahavira to begin with, and Jains ever since, have lived their lives based on this principle of non-violence. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, probably I can summarize Jainism or Jain tradition of last 2600 years. Uh,
Uh, Last
mhm.
question to you, of course,
Yeah.
is that on the theme of nonviolence and environmentalism,
Hmm.
when you philosophically look at it, I mean, um, do you think
Hmm.
that in our everyday lives, a greater consciousness of what violence we might be committing, even without realizing it, would
Hmm.
in many ways help us, you know, come closer to the calm that many people desperately seek but never find? Is nonviolence or being mindful or conscious about the violence that we might commit could it be one path to that sort of calm?
Yeah, I think we can all be mindful of our. I think to begin with, I guess like Jains, for Jains to be non-violent is to be vegetarian. So I think in our consumption of the way we consume natural resources, I think primarily is through food, and probably clothing and shelter. Uh, but for shelter, I think I'm not sure how much control can we exercise in the way we use building materials. Probably for clothing, we can exercise more control and probably limit our possessions to less clothing if possible. Other way we can be non-violent towards the nature is, I think, by preferring more renewable energy, for example, to, let's say, to, especially in Western countries, it's possible now to have an electric car and our house that can be run by renewable energy. So we can cut down on our consumption on fossil fuel, and we can, even that electric car, we can recharge based on renewable energy from at our home. So we completely are cutting down the violence towards the fossil fuel, towards Earth's resources in that way. Other way is definitely to cut down our meat consumption and even dairy products, because especially in the Western countries, we know that even the cattle's milk, or milk in general, comes with great violence towards cattle, and of course meat comes with all the violence that associated with it. And now we know that one of the biggest reasons for climate change, for world hunger, for water scarcity, for all kinds of issues, poverty and destruction of Amazonian forests, all of those symptoms are really interlinked with the meat consumption, because meat comes from animals. Animals need their food, and that food comes at the expense of Amazonian forests in South America, for instance. So if we are cutting down our meat consumption, we are helping the Amazonian forests that can survive better, because they won't have to be replaced with cattle ranches, for example. And we can also save a lot of water by cutting down our meat consumption, because it costs millions of gallons of water to raise all these cattle across North America and Europe for our consumption. So that way, I think that can be a big statement to be able to live non-violently in the world.
That's very
Yeah.
put indeed. That's very well put indeed, Professor Jain. And of course, now
Thank you.
increasingly there are options of laboratory produced meat. So hopefully,
Hmm. Yeah.
this is a sign of the times to come,
Yeah.
as meat production is questioned around the world. But thank you very much for speaking to us on the Grin podcast and sharing your ideas of nonviolence and how to adopt nonviolence in our day-to-day lives. I'm Hindol Sengupta. You were listening to the Grin podcast. Until next time, goodbye and thank you very much for listening.